20 years ago this summer, flared trousers and Saturday night fever were in. The economy, if not exactly booming, was in better shape than for some time. Labour supporters were cautiously optimistic about winning the next election. But then, in a few short months, all their hopes were dashed.
It's like seeing the Vietnam War on your television screens. To see all this happen, brought into the homes of everybody, every day.
My life was threatened. My wife received obscene calls. There was dead birds pushed through the door.
A devastating series of strikes brought the country to a halt and changed the face of British politics forever.
With people sitting round braziers, it looked on television to the country as if the revolution had begun.
Revolution indeed. Labour was cast into the wilderness for 19 years and Union power was smashed. It was called the Winter of Discontent. In the summer of 1978, the Labour leader, Jim Callaghan, had to make one decision that all Prime Ministers are judged by: when to hold the general election.
He called me into the study and he said, "I've decided on the date of the general election." And he took his pocket diary out and he looked at it and said, "It wouldn't be proper for me to tell you, but," he said, "I've decided when we're going to have a general election." And this was with the 1978 diary in his hand. And he said, "And I want you to start putting in place preparations for it," which of course I did.
Tom McNally wasn't the only one making plans. The trade unions were fed up after 3 years of incomes policy. Their members wanted the freedom to bargain for bigger wage increases. They had warned the Prime Minister that a difficult winter of pay claims lay ahead and had urged him to go for a quick election. At their Congress in Brighton that September, they, like many others, were expecting Big Jim to announce the date.
On Jim's instructions, I'd written the TUC speech as effectively a launch speech for a general election campaign. And he went through the whole structure of the speech as written, but then suddenly changed the conclusion. And instead of giving a ringing cry of "let's go to the country and here's why we should and here's why we deserve to win," he came out with this song.
There was I, waiting at the church. All at once, he sent me round a note.
It slowly dawned on the audience there was to be no autumn election.
Can't get away to marry you today. My wife won't let me.
Well, I disapproved of him singing songs. I like Jim. I had very great respect for him. I think he was one of the best Prime Ministers of the post-war period, next to Harold Macmillan. But to stand there and sing a ditty, I was perhaps too serious, I don't know, but I took a very serious view of Congress itself, and I thought Jim was treating them with a little bit of levity, which I disapproved of.
Now let me just make clear that I have promised nobody that I shall be at the altar in October. Nobody at all.
They clapped politely, but underneath, the trade union leaders were seething.
The really embarrassed people were David Besnett and the trade union leaders, because just before the Callaghan speech to the TUC, David Besnett called a press conference of the industrial correspondents, at which he dished out a press release saying, "We endorse the Prime Minister's obviously sensible decision to call a general election now. As you all know, there was nothing else he could have done." David was deeply embarrassed, furious.
It must be work and vote for Labour.
And Basnett in particular never really forgave Jim for playing the fool with the TUC General Council, which again didn't make for a good preparation for the battle ahead, because his enemies were still his enemies, and his friends felt bamboozled, to put it kindly.
It wasn't just the trade unions who were astonished. Labour had lost its majority in Parliament, and pay pressures on the economy were building up like water behind a dam. The government knew that to win an election the following year, they had to continue their successful fight against inflation. That meant holding down the pay rises workers were demanding to 5%.
Callaghan really wanted 0. And then he said, well, they won't accept that, I agree. Then I'd like 3. And I said, look, it's the 3rd year of what's been a successful policy so far, and you won't get 3. We'll try 5.
But after 3 years of wage restraint, even 5% was anathema to the unions. It was not a pretty prospect, the winter ahead.
And the only question is, would it be chaos? Would it be industrial revolution? Would it be a breakup of the economy? Well, the economic ministers took the view, I think they were entitled to take the view, that we would get away with it. So once Dennis Healey had said that forcibly to the cabinet, with a few sighs of apprehension, it was accepted without very much trouble.
The first big test came with the pay negotiations at Ford. Everyone knew that the figure they settled on there would be treated as a marker by both unions and management, public and private alike. The trouble was, Ford had done well that year, a £258 million profit for shareholders and an 80% rise for the managing director. Keeping the workers to 5% wasn't going to be easy.
I think everybody in Ford, from the shop floor up to the managing director, knew that it wasn't a goer, that there was no way we were going to get a settlement in the circumstances of that year at a 5% pay increase.
We'd had 10 years of either voluntary or statutory incomes policies. And I remember Harold Wilson himself once said that an incomes policy was very similar to a tourniquet. It could only be applied on odd occasions, otherwise the limb would wither. Well, in the summer of '78, the limb was withering.
On September the 21st, only a couple of weeks after Callaghan's fateful decision not to call an election, union leaders made their way down an uninviting alleyway in West London to hear the company's offer.
We don't want £19.99, we want 20.
If the union negotiators needed any reminder that 5% wouldn't wash, militant demonstrators were there to tell them.
Well, in those days the lobby was made up of hundreds of Ford workers from different parts of the country with union banners and placards and the general slogan for £20 on the pay and 1 hour off the day.
Don't forget the line workers.
Profits up, the chairman getting a huge bonus. We felt there was plenty of money there and we was entitled to our share. That's what we felt, because after all, it was the workers what earned the money.
The workers wanted 30%. Inside, management offered 5%.
Right at the beginning, I made a comment that we were negotiating in a framework of incomes policy. And I saw people on the other side sort of cringe, but they didn't interrupt.
Well, we told him that we weren't prepared to accept such a derisory offer, and we certainly weren't prepared to accept the company hiding behind the shield of the government's policy. It wasn't on the statute book, it was just a recommended policy of the government, and we demanded that you negotiate in a free collective bargaining atmosphere. And he declined and said, I'm sorry, we can't do that.
What happened basically was then conveners started going onto the phones and phoning back to their plants. Before you knew where you was, you started having the walkout.
As the news came through, Ford workers across the country gave their verdict on the offer.
Well, 5% no good to nobody, is it?
And I remember quite vividly, I worked in the foundry, and when people got the company leaflet, the company always produced a leaflet to explain their offer, hundreds and hundreds of men just tearing up the leaflets and burning them, and then everyone walking out in disgust.
What about 5%? What's your reaction now?
And 45 minutes later, they poured out for a mass meeting opposite the plant on what's known as Pork Chop Hill.
Within the hour of the answer coming back from London, Halewood was emptied. The section I was on, which was the Elephant House and the Well lines, which was quite a militant section, the supervisor called the lads together and said, I know there's going to be a strike, but could you just wait and be last out the gate? Because then we will get good points in the company's eyes. Now, and that was the level of supervision. And the people just, well, they gave their answer. And I think that the Elephant House and the Well lines was first out the gate, not the last out the gate.
The two sides were deadlocked. The government threatened to stop buying Ford cars if they didn't stick to 5%. But compared to the £1 million a day they were losing to the strike, it was like beating them with a feather duster.
I mean, first of all, we appealed to their sense of patriotism, which never works with multinational companies. Then we appealed to their sense of reason, which doesn't work any better. And then we began to threaten them.
What is most at stake is the huge number of Ford vehicles bought directly by the government every year, like this car behind me belonging to the civil service.
I personally didn't believe that even sanctions on Ford's cars was that much of a blow to the Ford Motor Company in terms of the 300 million that they'd made that year. I thought, quite frankly, that Fords were using the sanction argument as a sort of a shield against the trade unions.
And it's 1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for? You can stop your 5%, cause that won't pay the rent. And it's 5, 6, 7, picket in the factory gate. It's 1 in the eye for Sonny Jim, whoopee, we're going to win.
After 3 weeks, Ford had lost over £20 million. They abandoned government policy and sat down with the unions to negotiate. Whoever was nominally in charge, it was the activists in the so-called Ford Workers' Combine that helped set the pace.
So we tell them in the name of the working class, you can stuff it right up your arse.
I think the effect of the unofficial movement was to force the official movement to take a more militant position and make it much more difficult for the official movement to sell the strike out.
6, 7, picket in the factory gate.
There was a feeling of empowerment, but not that it was going to alter society too much. What it was going to do was right an injustice. Some of us would have liked to extend that, looking towards changing society, but the trade unions have never been identified as solidly revolutionary. They are not that.
Were you all just young revolutionaries who wanted to change the world?
What a wonderful title. Yeah, it don't look like it now.
The company's offer was quite diabolical, but our reply was categorical.
By now, it wasn't just activists who were undermining Labour's 5% policy. On November the 14th, the TUC General Council threw out a watered-down proposal for cooperation on pay. The government was on its own.
To us, it symbolised the great difficulty we had in having an anti-inflationary policy based on relations with the trade unions. So we were very depressed. I recall that as being almost the most depressing event of that autumn.
After a 9-week strike, the unions finally accepted an offer of around 17%. The settlement not only drove a cortina through the government's pay policy, it also showed how powerless Labour had become without the support of the unions.
In the end, the unions had to listen to their members. And the real problem with the unions was the activists, particularly in the shop steward movement, who were increasingly tending to take power away from the national union leaders.
I just felt that I had to do a job. That it conflicted with the government, I wasn't happy about, you know. But sometimes you have to come to the parting of the ways, and you do one job and they have to do another.
All those engaged.
None of them were willing to tell their members that the earth wasn't flat. They grasped free collective bargaining as a useful alternative to really explaining what what was coming down the track at them, which was Thatcherism.
The Ford settlement burst the wage policy dam, and the unions flooded in with demands for huge pay increases. In December, oil tanker drivers banned overtime in support of their demand for a 40% rise. Images of petrol queues and closed service stations filled the news reports. But what worried the government more was the threat to industry and essential services. At the Cabinet Office, they activated the Civil Contingencies Unit, or CCU, a body of ministers, civil servants and the military, which is called in times of national crisis. Troops were put on standby and trained to take over the tanker drivers' jobs. The plan was called Operation Drumstick, but before it could be put into effect, a national state of emergency would have to be declared.
Soldiers cannot use civilian equipment, private equipment. You can't introduce rationing without a declaration of emergency. That is what gives governments the power to requisition, in fact, private vehicles.
Everyone held their breath. Major General Tillotson was the military representative on the CCU.
We had servicemen from all three services trained in the handling of the tankers at certainly 3 or 4 points where they were specifically prepared to take over the tanker drivers.
Calling a state of emergency divided the cabinet. Few were in favour, but all recognised that unless the dispute was resolved, they would have no other option.
The state of emergency was just upping the odds. I mean, it was, in a sense, going for broke. It was the power of the state against the unions. And if we could get away without elevating the dispute to those rather dramatic levels, we wanted to do it.
I thought we had to be prepared for it, but that's going a little bit further than I thought it was necessary to go, and indeed it did. I mean, that would almost have produced a situation which was morally a civil war.
As Christmas approached, the Energy Secretary at the time, Tony Benn, called the union leaders in to discuss the crisis.
Tony gave me a particular warning that in the event of there being a strike of the tanker drivers, then he would have to use troops.
I was involved in those talks. There was principally 2 trade union leaders involved in that. And I and my fellow ministers may have been responsible for giving the impression that if we couldn't get an agreement to deal with important emergency services and keep cover on, say, for hospitals, for example, that the Cabinet would probably decide on a state of emergency.
I don't think a state of emergency would have made very much difference to the dispute on the ground. I suppose it's the psychology that really mattered, that the government meant business, that the government wasn't going to be pushed around.
Someone must have forgotten to pass on the message. The employers capitulated.
I was now with the employers in Transport House and told them of the problems we're going to experience, and they came to an agreement with me, which of course was a tremendous relief. As a matter of fact, I was so relieved. I'm not a very generous person, but I had a driver and I sent him out a couple of bottles of scotch and a bottle of gin, and I drank the health with the employers there, and we had a very pleasant Christmas. Very pleasant Christmas.
A happy Christmas for the unions, but not the government. They avoided a state of emergency, but it was clear that as the tanker drivers settled for a 15% rise, it was union muscle that was running the show. The 5% pay limit was being ignored by almost everyone except the government.
I now think that 5 was a mistake, because I think that it did overload the circuit, as proved to be the case, and produced the winter discontent. And I think if we'd said single figures, we'd have finished with an outturn maybe 12%, a little bit over, but we would have avoided the winter of discontent.
In the new year, as the winter weather worsened, the Prime Minister flew to the Caribbean for a sunny summit. World leaders had a number of heavyweight issues on the agenda, including strategic arms limitation and the future of Britain's nuclear deterrent. But for some of the press corps, the sight of the Prime Minister relaxing in the sun, whilst at home the nation shivered in the snow and a new wave of strikes, was too much.
Looking back on it, it was surreal. Here we were in a tropical paradise with, remember, the Daily Mail photographers in particular, briefed to get any photograph they could of the Prime Minister in a bathing suit.
Before coming home, the Prime Minister managed to grab a few days' holiday in Barbados. With striking lorry drivers making the headlines back home, it was a move that gave his spin doctors a headache.
We got a message through that there'd been a request for the Prime Minister to meet the press at Heathrow when he landed. And Tom McCaffrey, the press secretary, said, don't do it. Go to number 10, get a feel for things. Then you can broadcast to the nation this evening. I took a contrary view. I said, no, why, the drama of Jim's back and Jim's in charge, and that would give us leadership and give us ownership of the problem. I walked into that press conference believing that is exactly what he was going to do.
They feel that we've been working hard, as indeed we have, and I actually swam.
Instead of which he turned all whimsical and started talking about his swimming in Barbados, and I just thought, God, this isn't it.
What is your general approach and view of the mounting chaos in the country at the moment?
Well, that's a judgment that you are making. I promise you that if you look at it from outside, and perhaps you're taking a rather parochial view at the moment, I don't think that other people in the world would share the view that there is mounting chaos.
I'm standing behind him during that interview, and I knew he was getting it wrong. It was one of those terrible things where you feel like you'd like to yank your man off and start again, but that was not to be. And of course, Walter Terry, in The Sun the next day, encapsulated the mood. There's crisis, what crisis? And that hung around our neck for the rest of the government.
He never actually used the words crisis, what crisis? But what Jim said wasn't that far away from crisis, what crisis? He asked for it, I'm afraid, and he got it.
Jim still saw the disputes as they popped up as manageable difficulties in an overall picture of economic recovery and economic improvement and general government success.
A breathtaking analysis looking back on it. By the middle of January, the road haulage system was grinding to a halt. The country, already suffering from a particularly savage winter, now faced paralysis. "80% of the nation's goods were transported by road, and the country faced the very real prospect of food shortages. To make matters worse, the drivers who were on strike began picketing firms where the drivers were still continuing to work. As supplies ran short, over 250,000 workers were laid off. The city of Hull was particularly hard hit by the striking lorry drivers. Fred Beach was a local union official.
Hull had the title of Siege City, second Stalingrad, because nothing went in and nothing came out. That was our proud boast.
With only 2 main roads into the city, it was easy to apply a stranglehold. Barry Andrews was one of the striking drivers.
We had to picket 24 hours a day, and we was at it 6 weeks, and you can imagine it was snowing and hailing all the time, and it was really a mega problem trying to keep the lads' morale going.
If you could see him coming in here when he was to come in for a cup of tea, just as I was coming off the Russian front, the boats all covered in snow, because they had the scarves around their heads. We had some good tubs, and I was real proud of them, I was honest.
The tactics was to stop the freight moving up and down the country, and if we could block the estates and the arterial roads, that's what the tactics was. If there was a major problem in any part of the city, then we would send flying pickets down.
It was the secondary picketing that made the strike so effective. Just outside Hull, on the Humber estuary, Esso and Shell had a huge petroleum storage facility. The oil tanker drivers had only just gone back after their own dispute, but they still found a way of helping the road haulage strikers.
The arrangements we had was, as the lads was coming down here, we had on the top of the road, as we turned into this road, we had 3 or 4, maybe half a dozen cars stood there. And as the tanker drivers went past, they'd drop a note out the window. So all we needed to do then was to pick the notes up and we knew where they were going. And of course when they got there, when the tanker got there, there's one of us waiting for them. And they wouldn't cross picket lines, so they just brought the load back. And that was a successful, you say half a dozen of us, with a few cars, were able to make a severe impact.
So if it ain't on that list, you're not going in. Well, you know.
I'm not sure how serious the road haulage dispute was economically, but I think it was very important politically. It was spreading the bad news throughout the country. Every town and village felt they were affected by the winter of discontent.
As the dispute worsened, the Cabinet were once again faced with the prospect of declaring a state of emergency and bringing the troops in. All around the country, soldiers were put on standby.
We had many thousands of trucks standing by with their drivers to deploy to the areas where they'd be required to maintain essential supplies in this case. That was entirely realistic. We could not possibly replace the whole of the road haulage system for the United Kingdom, anything like that, but we could make a stab at it and deal with it in the short term.
The government was very, very close to bringing in the military, but in the end, Mr. Callaghan couldn't bring himself to do that. He'd spent his whole career working with the trade unions, and he once said to me, I've always worked with the unions, they've always supported me, and I could not bring myself at this final stage to turn against them and use the military against them.
Not only the Cabinet was divided over the use of troops, civil servants in the Civil Contingency Unit were also nervous. It led to angry exchanges between Sir Clive Rose and the Transport Secretary, Bill Rogers.
He and other civil servants, sometime in January, decided that the battle was lost and the government was lost. And I think that they were in a mood to prevent any damage which might be difficult for an incoming government, whenever it might be.
Well, I always maintained that the function of the CCU was to save the country's bacon and not to save the government's bacon.
Len Murray and Moss Evans were summoned to Downing Street to discuss the crisis. The government, using the only weapon they had left, once again threatened to use troops if essential goods weren't moved. As this union document shows, it worked.
To prevent intervention of emergency powers, we would recommend to strike committees that to ensure that troops are not used, they accept these priorities.
The priorities for transport included animal feedstuffs and pharmaceuticals. But whatever the union leaders agreed with the government, on the ground it was the local shop stewards who decided who got what by way of essential supplies. They set up what they rather grandly called dispensation committees.
The dispensation committee was lorry drivers. Yesterday, they was driving a lorry for a living. Today, they're controlling the movements of essential goods. And the governments are talking about bringing in a Transport Act because essential goods were being prohibited from being moved around the country. So the seriousness of that, planted into 5 ordinary lorry drivers, was immense. The responsibility was immense.
I don't think there was anyone on that dispensation didn't have doubts. What are we doing? As he said, well, we had no CV for this. We'd trained as lorry drivers and been lorry drivers. We was out of our depth, but we had to go on with it. Somebody had to do it.
We were so inexperienced and so amateurish that within a day we had a queue outside of this room door, 3 deep, 40 yards long, and into the street, of businessmen from all quarters of commerce and industry. We're talking about people who ran major industries, and they had to stand outside that door and wait until we could speak to them.
A major problem was animal feeds. Pigs and poultry in intensive farms require a carefully balanced diet. In Hull, food was getting through and animals weren't starving, but because of the dispute, they weren't getting the correct feed mix. To highlight what could happen to animals, farmers demonstrated outside the union headquarters.
We all filed out, and he lowered the tailgate down off the trailer, and then he commenced pulling dead pigs, little beautiful little chubby piglets, and laying them like a row of Coldstream Guards in the gutter.
We had to bring home to them that we do look after the animals, we do care for the animals, we do want to see that they get the correct rations. And the only way to bring this to public attention and get the sympathy of the public and of the Transport and General Workers Union was to say, look, this is what's going to happen to animals.
And they will start to die from starvation or deprivation from next Tuesday morning unless we can get the food through. That is the problem on the one side.
Then he started then. This is what you so-and-sos have created. Look at these, all these little dead pigs.
Unless you publicise the effort, you don't get the reaction that you're looking for. And we wanted people to say, well, look, we can't have this happening to animals.
And he got some chickens, and he took them by the legs and held them up. And the heads of the chickens were lolling, simply because, of course, the necks had been wrung. They didn't die of starvation. They'd been... And we said to him, listen, by the time you leave here, you'll be plucking those chickens for your dinners tomorrow. And as for the piglets, the sow had laid over on its brood and suffocated them. And of course, it started as such a serious business, but when it was exposed, he couldn't get them chickens and pigs back into his truck fast enough.
The road haulage strike lasted for 6 weeks. Despite the government's continuing efforts to stick to 5%, the drivers went back with an extra 20% in their pay packets. But there were few winners long-term on either side. Ken Wake used to run a fleet of trucks from this yard.
We were all worried sick, really worried sick. I mean, I'd built a business up from nothing to 70 trucks in 25 years. And I had to sit and watch it crumble, and so did every other haulier. In the end, we had to find the money, but we paid the price. I don't know how many hauliers went out of business or how many drivers' jobs were lost, but there was a lot. There it goes. It's the way it goes. I once found myself talking to myself. I said, who on earth can create such a situation as this? And I decided only the devil could do it. It was so unreal. Never known in British history before. Hopefully never again.
Took the chop when the tube's gone up and the bus is stopped. Top folks still come out on top. The government never resigned.
On January the 22nd, 1.5 million public service employees staged a day of action in support of £60 minimum wage for the low paid. There was now no hiding place for the government, because in this dispute, they themselves were the employers. As schools were shut down and the railwaymen went on strike, their battered policy faced its ultimate test.
I think it stinks like all the other damn strikes in this country run by the filthy socialist communist unions.
Strikes by ambulancemen and hospital ancillary staff soon meant that nearly half the country's hospitals could handle emergencies only. It wasn't just the government who were embarrassed, as volunteers had to be brought in to keep a rudimentary health service going. Just as in the Ford strike, at London's Westminster Hospital, union activists were making the most of it. Shop steward Jamie Morris was running a local dispute there.
It was so close to Parliament's home. It was so close to MPs' hearts. It frightened them. They'd never actually faced the reality of what was going on in the country. And health was a personification of all the other strikes.
The Health Minister, David Ennals, spent a few days in Westminster Hospital during the strike, so it was frequently in the news. Much to the annoyance of the NUPE leadership, Jamie Morris appeared to be hijacking the national dispute by his constant media appearances.
But what about the Code of Conduct?
What Code of Conduct?
The national union officers of NUPE were very unhappy about Jamie Morris's behaviour. They saw him as a maverick who had taken control of their national dispute in a way that they found themselves very difficult to deal with.
The senior officers of the union would have liked to have had control of the strike. My view was that they weren't on strike. They hadn't called the strike. They hadn't voted for it. They hadn't voted against it. Therefore, it was none of their business. It was the branch that was on strike. We had our specific reasons for being on strike. And I took my orders from my members, not from trade union officials.
The dispute at Westminster Hospital was finally resolved at an all-night meeting at the Health Authority headquarters. After hours of talks, the Health Minister, now out of hospital, was called in to approve a deal well above the 5% level the government had once considered so critical.
David Ennals arrives at 5 o'clock in the morning, bleary-eyed, in a suit. And I look at him, and I look, and I can't believe it. At the bottom of his trousers are his pyjamas. He hasn't even bothered to get dressed. He looked like Coco the Clown with these bright striped pyjama trousers sticking out the bottom of his trouser leg. And all he kept saying was, "Can we get this sewn up? I want to get back to bed." And I thought, this is a farce. If you put this on the BBC as a comedy, nobody would believe you. It would be too far-fetched. And it really was. It just sort of summed everything up, that somehow nobody was taking it seriously by that time.
One or two of the Labour ministers were historically very close to the trade unions and trade union leaders in their departmental areas. David Ennals at Health was an example of that. And I think they found it very difficult to resist the unions in their areas. And I remember at one cabinet committee, Mr. Ennals explaining why a 15% settlement was something of a triumph for the government. And I think I knew it was all over then.
By the end of January, the public image of both government and union was in freefall. Up in Liverpool, even the gravediggers had gone on strike.
Our members were so frustrated, so angry at the way they were treated, that I think they had to demonstrate to people the value of the work that they do. And unfortunately, the only way you can highlight terms and conditions is when you actually withdraw that labour.
I was shocked, that's all. Just shocked. It was the kind of action that if you had any sort, if you're as one human being to another, if you have regard for people when they're bereaved and they're mourning and so on, and if you feel you are part of the human race, you can't withdraw a service like that. At least that was my feeling.
The gravediggers were poorly paid and did have bad working conditions. Nevertheless, the press seized on this isolated case as a symptom of the madness that was infecting the whole country.
You'd walk through the streets and you'd get people shouting, "He's the fella that won't let them bury the dead." I was a 26-year-old shop steward working for Liverpool City Council, trying to represent the interests of people who elected me. I was a bit naive myself those days, but I mean, you can be held up as sort of a bogeyman.
You just called his names and
went past our front gate when we were on strike, shouting abuse at us and everything. No, it wasn't very nice. And I think today it still goes on.
As the coffins piled up, the City Council were forced to store the bodies in a disused factory in Speke. The press hounds were now in full cry.
A newspaper reporter rang me up one evening when I was just about to go home. I was tired and upset by all that had been going on. And he said, "Now, you know, what's happening, Doc? I gather there are lots of unburied bodies lying around and so on." And I said, "Yes, but, you know, while it's a grave affront to the next of kin, you know, this really isn't a public health problem. We've got plenty of cold storage available for weeks, months if necessary." And he just badgered me and went on and said, now, come on, if this goes on for months, what'll happen? And to be honest, I lost my cool and said, "Oh, well, look, if necessary, we'll have to bury them at sea." Now, to me, that didn't sound strange. I'd been a naval officer, I'd been a surgeon lieutenant in the RNVR, and I thought this was a dignified and honourable way of disposing of the dead. And so I was absolutely astonished the next morning to read all over the newspapers in banner headlines, "Burials at sea," says medical officer. And I must confess, I was horrified.
As the dispute dragged on, yet again, the Civil Contingencies Unit were forced to consider alternatives.
Gravediggers, to everyone's surprise, was the responsibility of the Department of the Environment, and the Secretary of State for Environment was Peter Shaw at the time, who was attending some debate in the House and came in rather late, brushing back his hair in that manner of his. And and Merlin Rees said to him, "Well, Peter, what do you think we can do about gravediggers? We really don't think that the army should do that." And he said, "Oh dear, surely we could at least provide a skeleton service."
The gravediggers went back to work with a 14% pay rise. It had only been a 2-week strike, but it had a profound effect on the Prime Minister.
I don't think Jim was ever psychologically able to accept how brutal a minority of trade unionists would be. I mean, Jim couldn't believe that good trade unionists would not bury the dead. Couldn't believe that good trade unionists would stand at hospital gates and say, "You're not an urgent case, go away and we'll look after your hernia 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years' time from now."
Well, they went out of control, literally. I mean, if by control you mean the ability of the TUC to influence unions and the ability of unions to influence their members. It was the working men and women themselves saying, "Look, we can't stand it any longer."
By now, though, other council workers were also going on strike. Everything from the gritting lorries to the school caretakers. But most damaging of all to the government's image was the strike by the refuse men. By the beginning of February, the rubbish was piling up, a disturbing symbol of the state to which the country had descended. For Tory newspapers, it was a godsend. Herbie Knott, a freelance photographer, was dispatched by the Evening Standard to get pictures of rats in the rubbish. He found them just off London's Haymarket.
I came down here and waited until the streets got quiet and people had come out of the theatres and the restaurants had closed. And up popped the rat, followed by another one. And they came up from that grating over there, scurried across the pavement to some bags of rubbish which had been left out by a restaurant. And I got about half a dozen frames, 10 frames, something like that.
Looking back on what happened subsequently with a very long period of Conservative government, it was a politically important picture. And those with access to grind made full use of it.
The rat picture made the front page of the Standard and was picked up by the Nationals the next day. Never mind the story quality, feel the impact.
We pulled every dirty trick in the book to get rid of Callaghan and Labour, because the unions were running riot, they were running the country and causing mayhem. I mean, we could come out with big headlines, bury the dead, there were piles of rubbish in the streets because the dustmen were on strike, and we made it look as if this was general, universal and eternal. In fact, it was only fragmentary here and there, was no great big problem.
The Labour movement was busy throwing itself on every sword or spear available. I mean, it was an act of self-destruction which a hostile conservative media very effectively, indeed brilliantly, recorded.
The end of the government, when it came, was swift. Labour's majority depended on support by the Scottish nationalists. When a devolution referendum vote went the wrong way, they withdrew their support. An election became unavoidable.
About halfway through the election campaign, I was travelling with Mr. Callaghan in his car back to number 10 and trying to cheer him up. I said, well, things were beginning to go our way. And he looked at me and just said, Bernard, he said, there's been a sea change taken place in British politics, and that tide is towards Mrs. Thatcher, and there's nothing we can do in this election campaign to change that.
By the time of the general election on the 3rd of May, the strikes had petered out. But the damage, both to Labour and the power of the unions, was irretrievable.
Here comes the Prime Ministerial rover, bearing now Mrs. Thatcher as Prime Minister.
The winter of discontent brought down the Labour government. Without the winter of discontent, we would have gone on to October, and we might well have gone back with a small majority or the largest single party. We wouldn't have been shattered in the way we were. It started off a chain of events which put the Labour Party out of power for nearly 20 years and also made the Labour Party stand on its head about its ideology.
It wasn't the unions who defeated the Labour government. The Labour government defeated the Labour government. Because if they couldn't recognise that people are prepared to cooperate and try to be loyal, but it goes on only so long. And when they see around them everything else going through the roof, except their ability to improve their wages and conditions, even politicians must recognise, you know, we've got a tiger by the tail, we can't hold this.
Suddenly the trade union movement was given a power and an influence and a central position in our political life greater than at any time in its history. Any time in its history. And in reality, when given that power and responsibility, they ran away from it. And beginning the process of being well and truly screwed by Mrs. Thatcher. And it's difficult not to say, boy, didn't you deserve her.
Sometimes it's necessary to dump your own. You know, it's better to have a bad Tory than a bad socialist government. And I think that Labour government was so bad and had lost its way so often that it was a farce, and it was wrong to allow it to continue.
Nobody thinking about these events can really deny the overwhelming truth that the unions virtually destroyed themselves. They invited Mrs. Thatcher and disciplinary legislation to deny them the power to ever do again what their members did to the community and the country in that winter of discontent.
The productivity deal
They'll cut your meal breaks, your tea breaks too, and the next in line they'll want to cut you. So we tell them in the name of the working class, you can stuff it right up your arse. And it's 1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for? You can stuff your 5%, cause that won't pay the rent. And it's 5, 6, 7, picket in the factory gates. It's 1 in the eye for Sonny Jim, whoopity, we're